Good afternoon. How was lunch? Who needs a safety nap? Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for being here this afternoon. It's my distinct pleasure to spend this time with you. I'm going to enjoy this, and I hope you, if you don't enjoy it, at least I hope you get something out of this discussion. This is a discussion between you and I. What I would like you to think of as I'm a relief pilot, and I just showed up at your base, and the three of us are going to go fly together tonight, and you don't know me, so you may have some questions. You can stop me at any time in this discussion. Just put your hand up or holler out if you have something you want to add to this, and I will probably look at some of you right square in the face and ask you questions. So, my name's Dan. I flew helicopters for 30 years. I spent 17 years in EMS. When I stopped, actually before I stopped flying, I decided that I wanted to take the Air Medical Resource Management message on the road. So I started an LLC, AMRM Training Solutions. I blog at a website called helicopterems.com, and there's a Facebook page that goes with that. So I started, my EMS career started working for Penn State Lifeline. Anybody familiar with Penn State Lifeline in this room? How about those Nittany Lions? I spent time with Keystone Helicopters, Geisinger Life Flight, because Penn State and Geisinger had a divorce in the early 90s. And I learned to fly in the military, and during my military career, I spent some time with the 3rd Battalion of the 160th. Retired from the Army in 1998, stopped flying 2 years ago. A couple of people have asked me to make comments, so I said I would. Ads and credits, people that I'd just like you to consider. While we were at the Air Medical Transport Conference, I'm on the board of directors of NEMSPA, the National EMS Pilot Association, and I had the pleasure of meeting a young man right next to our booth. So our booth was here, and this young fellow was next to us, and we started chatting, and it turns out he's a very personable young guy. He's a Special Forces soldier, medically trained, and I think he's actually still in the Guard or the Reserves. And he and some other entrepreneurs started a company called IA Med. They train the physician's assistants for the 160th, and they also do classes to prepare paramedics and flight nurses for their certification testing for the FPC and the CFRN. And they do a 4-day intensive class session. It costs $500. So if you are yourself looking at having to do that, or if you know somebody else who is, give them a look. You can Google them, check them out on the internet. As in our discussion, we found out that he hired a very experienced medic from Savannah, Georgia, named Carol Crockett. And I've known Carol Crockett for about 20 years, and when he said that she worked with him, I said, that's the bona fides for me. And also, they are a sponsor of this conference, so we should be grateful to them. Check them out. NEMSPA, the National EMS Pilots Association. By the way, how many pilots are in the room? If you're a pilot, if you're an EMS helicopter or a medical airplane pilot, hold your hand up. So I don't know if you feel the way I do, but that's broken, right? These conferences are designed to allow all of us to interact and become more familiar with each other, to increase our ability to work together. So we are going to, as we go downstream, we're going to try to think of ways to increase pilot participation in events such as this. This is not, it's the same problem that we see at AMTC, that pilots tend to not go. So we'll come up with some things to entice pilots to come. If you are involved with a flight program, I would like to tell you that NEMSPA is re-rolling out one of their projects, which is the CHAMPS survey, and there are cards, I think cards on the back table there that talk about the changes to CHAMPS. And I would like to, anybody from Geisinger Life Flight in the room? There was in the spring conference. So Geisinger hired me to go to Danville 2 times this year and paid me to do an 8-hour AMRM training session. And the money that Geisinger paid for me to come here today. So I'm thanking Geisinger, and I'm very grateful. They financed this trip for me. I'm 60 years old, and I flew for 30 years, and I now work part-time on a dolphin boat. And I can tell you that the things that I talk about in an AMRM class apply when I'm working as a crew member on a dolphin boat. And the mistakes that we make, the communication problems we have, it manifests no matter what you're doing. So as I say, you never stop learning, and I'm glad you're here today. So what got me started doing this? A friend named Pat Walters and a nurse named Diana Connor and a paramedic named Claxton Dove. They crashed right up the road from where I was working in Charleston, South Carolina. And if you've ever been involved in a crash and you've had to bury your friends, you know it's a horrible experience. So I volunteered to say, well, is there anything we can do to perhaps stop these crashes from occurring? I mean, I'll try anything. And the tool that OmniFlight thought was going to work was called Air Medical Resource Management, and I got involved in that. And the great part about this is, my friend Randy Main says, we're not really teachers, we're facilitators. We learn as much from you as you learn from us. My friend Jonathan Godfrey is probably in the room somewhere. Jonathan is a HEMS industry icon, and he is also an AMRM facilitator. This discussion today is extremely sensitive because we're talking about real-world crashes, real people. And in some cases, someone in this room will know some of the people that we will discuss. It is not my intent to disrespect anyone who has been involved in a tragic event. That's not what this is about. This is not sensationalistic. This is not designed to be hurtful. This is designed for us to learn whatever we can learn so that we do not repeat that event. A pilot came up to me at the NEMSABA booth. He's a guy who's actually on the board of directors, and he looked at me and he said, you know, Dan, we're not going to stop these crashes. We're not going to do it. I disagree with that. I disagree that there is some number of crashes, some number of souls that we have to lose each year. I just don't agree with that. My number is 0. When I was learning to fly in 1985, very early on, I was going through the Chinook transition, and a Chinook ran into a Cobra at Fort Stewart, Georgia. And I remember reading about this in the Flight Facts magazine, and I thought, well, that's something that happens to other people, right? When somebody crashes, that's not real. I don't know them. It's not really pertinent to me. And besides which, I would never do that because those people that crashed, there was something wrong with them. They were somehow defective. And the more I study crashes and the longer I'm involved in this discussion, the more I realize that those people are just like me. They're just like you. They're not, these people that are involved in these events are not substandard, they're not defective. They're good human beings. And something goes wrong. So, when we talk about what happens in a helicopter or an airplane, there's decisions being made, aeronautical decision making, there's behaviors that manifest, and the thing to keep in mind is that the attitude that you carry within you drives your behavior. The way you feel about the situation you're in determines your response to that situation. And unfortunately, sometimes our feelings can be malformed. We can get the wrong feelings. We can get the wrong attitudes. When we examine crashes, depending on who you ask, 80 to 90% of the time when we have a crash, it is not because a helicopter broke. 80 to 90% of the time when we have a crash, it's because some human involved made a mistake. Human factors or human failings. So let's talk about some crashes. Between 1983 and 2011, 230 medical helicopters crashed. That's a scary number. In 2015, there were 4 crashes with fatalities. That picture is of Pat Walters' crash site right there. And we actually had a pretty good time up until Pat crashed. Pat and Claxton and Diana, we went a long time. One of my personal goals has been to see if by traveling and talking and writing, if we could go a whole year. And we actually did go a whole year without killing anybody in a medical helicopter. It hadn't happened, per Dr. Blumen, it hadn't happened since like 1990. So we actually can go a whole year. And if we can go a year, then we can go 5 years. And if we can go 5 years, the airlines, by the way, Delta, United, the airlines, they haven't killed anybody in a long time, right? So what are they doing that we're not doing? The airlines don't take it for granted that somebody has to perish in an aircraft. There was a magazine that came out, and it had a pretty stark number, and it said if you flew for 20 years, 20 hours a week, I mean, of course, most people aren't flying 20 hours a week, that you had a 40% chance of losing your life. That was an eye-catching number. I don't think that it's God's will when a crash occurs. I don't think it's fate. I don't think it's inevitable. And I hope that I never again read that when somebody puts in a magazine, she died doing what she loves. That's not the deal. That's not the deal. Chad Hammond's widow found his license at his crash site right after he crashed March 26, 2016 in Alabama. Pretty tough stuff. We can actually change how we think, how we behave, and we can change our attitude in this industry, and we can not have adverse events. It's up to us. So the attitudes we're going to talk about: machoism, invulnerability, get-home-itis, or as Randy would say, press-on-itis, anti-authority, complacency, impulsivity, resignation. I'm going to confess to you that in my 30 years of flying, I fell prey to every single one of those attitudes at some point in time. No one is in hazardous attitudes. No one's invulnerable. So what do I have to do? I have to watch for it in myself. I have to watch for it in you, my crew, my flight team, my crew. I like to call you guys crew members. I get in trouble for that. Who in here is a crew member? Everybody put your hand up if you're going, right? You're a crew member. Good. Good for you. Don't let the FAA tell you what you are. So, the things we're going to talk about. If you are intimately familiar with any of these crashes, again, guys, it is not my intent to be hurtful. That's not the objective. So, first, resignation. As long as the rotor is turning on top of your helicopter or the airplane is flying through the air, you can influence the situation positively. Please do not ever give up. Anybody here know Kishma Rollins? Yes, John Von Ron. So Kishma Rollins was a nurse that I worked with down in Charleston, South Carolina. She's about this tall. She's Hawaiian. She's a pretty strong lady, very experienced flight nurse. And Kishma, God bless her, she had a bit of a history of generating friction with pilots because Kishma was the kind of person that liked to ask questions. Why are we doing this the way we're doing this? And some pilots are very adept at dealing with that, and some pilots not so much. So she volunteered to go from Charleston to Myrtle Beach, and Omniflight Helicopters hired a pilot fresh from HMX-1. Any Marines in the room? HMX-1 is the helicopter that flies the President of the United States. So as you can imagine, if you're a pilot flying the President of the United States, you might have a high opinion of yourself and your abilities. And this gentleman that they hired to be the lead pilot or the base manager up in Myrtle Beach, he did have a high opinion of himself. And it wasn't very long before Kishma called me on the phone and she says, you know, I'm having a real problem with this base manager you guys sent up here. And I said, well, Kishma, you have to work at it. Well, number one, Kishma, you have a reputation for getting sideways with pilots, and you need to work with him and work this out. But they didn't. And so she complained up the chain of command within Omniflight. She says, this guy's doing things wrong, and nobody listened to her. Because they said, well, it's just a nurse making trouble. You know, aviation, on top of a company, you have aviation, and you have clinical, and sometimes it's just Kishma being Kishma. And she really did get mad. I mean, she said it over and over again, and nobody would listen to her. And her chief complaint was that this pilot, when he would make his approaches at night, this was before goggles, he would, instead of coming into a scene at a high altitude, a safe altitude, and doing a high recon and all the steps, and making a relatively steeper approach, he liked to start his approaches way out and basically just troll or drag that helicopter in at a very shallow angle. And the reason we don't do that, if you're not familiar with helicopter operations, is we're worried about hitting wires, right? We want to come in at an angle that's steep enough so that we have a very good chance of not hitting anything, because wires are hard to see. Wires are hard to see through goggles, by the way. Even if you have night vision goggles, wires are hard to see. So he made his approaches at a shallow angle, and Kishma wasn't getting any traction. Nobody would listen to her, and she just got mad. I mean, they had these arguments, and one night they get toned out. They're in a Bell 206 L3, and they get into this helicopter, her and the pilot and a paramedic named Brent, and she got on the back of that helicopter. And she crosses her arms, and she says, I don't give a doggone what this son of a gun does. I'm just going to sit here. And they're flying to a Shoney's parking lot, to the scene of an accident, to pick up a patient. And she looks at what he's doing, and she looks out, and she says, he's doing it again. He's coming in low and shallow, shallow approach. And then she looked out, and she saw the power line poles. And she was so angry, she said, I'm going to teach this guy a lesson. I'm not going to say anything. And then that Bell 206 jerked forward. It was acted upon by an outside force. It jerked forward. They all went forward in their seat. The aircraft pitched nose down, nose up. The pilot struggled to regain control. He did get control of the helicopter, and he successfully landed it. And God bless Kishma. She's a pretty tough cookie. She gets out. She says, we're out of service, dude. We're going by ground. You better stay here. So they went and did the patient transport. When we examined the helicopter, I don't know if you ever saw the picture of this. We examined the helicopter. Our 206 has a vertical fin on the back, and at the lower portion of the vertical fin, there was a notch where a 3/4-inch power line, aluminum power line, went into the bottom fin of that aircraft. It went in about 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch, before the wire busted. The spooky thing was that when you took the tail rotor blade and you rotated the tail rotor blade around, the blade went below the notch. So my director of operations, Clark Kirshner, said, quote, we dodged a bullet last night. Imagine if that tail rotor had hit that wire and come off that helicopter. So they had a big base meeting, and they got all the clinicians together in one room, and they came to the conclusion that they were going to free up that man's future. Because they said, look, you don't have to, you can do what you want, but nobody here is getting in a helicopter. So Kishma then transfers out to Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and she meets this dude's evil twin. And the guy's like yelling at her and throwing knee boards at her, and they landed at some hospital, and she said, mister, I will flat stomp you into the ground if you ever talk to me that way again, and you are not killing me in a helicopter. Somebody's already tried to do that. You're going to listen to what I tell you. God bless Kishma Rollins. If you ever find yourself in a situation, if you're ever working for a company that's more worried about money than you, remember that you can get another job. You can't get another you, right? There are other jobs. Geisinger Lifelike, great program. Anyway, I'll pitch for Geisinger. Never resign yourself to fate. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a dark discussion, and this is about airplanes. This is not about helicopters. The benefit of looking at airplane crashes is that for years, airplanes have had cockpit voice recorders. So when we look at a crash, we don't have to say what was going on. We don't, what were they saying? We know, because it's recorded. Right? And now these recorders are coming into helicopters, which is a blessing. I know some pilots resent that they're having themselves recorded, and there's troubles with the union, and the benefit outweighs the cost, I can tell you. So an airplane went to pick up a set of lungs with a transplant team on board. The vendor for the University of Michigan survival flight was called Marlin Air, and they had a long history of successful operations with this vendor. A young physician in the back of that airplane was killed, and a fellow that I was talking to down at Med Center Air in Charlotte was personal friends with this physician. A very good-hearted soul. In his life, he would have probably saved thousands of lives, made a huge contribution to society, and he was taken from us, and as was the rest of his team. So they were going to, like I said, get a set of lungs. If you're interested in crashes, by the way, the place to start your research, if you want to become a person that talks about crashes, go to the NTSB reports. So as the first sign of trouble, the airplane is flying in with a team in the back. And by the way, in airplanes, crew members tend to be passengers more so than crew members. Typically in an airplane, they're not wearing a headset or a helmet. They don't, in an airplane, the clinicians tend to be not as involved in the conduct of a flight. So these clinicians are in the back, and the pilots are going in there, and the co-pilot says, hey, I'm going to call and get the weather up where we're going to land. And the captain said, don't do that, because if they give us weather below minimums, we're screwed. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the first sign of a hazardous attitude being manifested. What that captain is referring to is that it is against the rules, against the regulations to commence an instrument approach, that's in the clouds, flying in the clouds. It's against the rules to start an approach if the weather is worse than what is required for the approach. Once you start an approach, once you pass the final approach fix inbound, you can continue the approach no matter what happens to the weather. You can continue it and see what happens when you get to the minimum descent altitude or the decision altitude. So this pilot in command says, don't ask about the weather, because if it's below our minimums or below the approach minimums, we're not going to go in there. Not good. Not good. So they're talking to approach, and they get instructed to contact the air traffic control tower, and the captain once again tells the co-pilot, don't ask about the weather. So that's complacency, invulnerability, anti-authority. And by the way, all these attitudes feed each other. One feeds on another. And that pilot, by the way, was the chief pilot for Marlin Air. The chief pilot is making a statement like that. And because I'm a helicopter pilot, not an airplane pilot, and in the EMS helicopters I've always flown, the crew is wearing a headset. I don't think you would have a conversation like that. And if I did say something like that, I would trust that a nurse or a paramedic would say, that's really a stupid idea, Dan. I don't think we should do that. So how do programs get broken? There was a crash down in the Gulf of Mexico, I want to say off Florida, and the program director was famously reported to refer to patients as golden trout. You get out there and you go get those golden trout. That's a broken company, right? They've lost their way. When that pervades an organization, that you start thinking like that, you're in line for hurt. And this can happen. This can happen in a helicopter program. I've actually seen this happen. And I've seen this happen, and then it ended badly. So they go back to the airport, they have their lungs, and they're getting ready to take off. So they're taxiing out to the departure runway. They never ran what is appropriate for two pilots, which is called either challenge and response or challenge do verify. So I have a checklist, and I say flap set, and the other person says flap set, puts his hand on the switch. They didn't do that. They called off some items, but they never actually ran the checklist. They got their clearance, told them to go straight up. They're taking off basically north, go straight up to 2,000 feet, and then make a right turn to 050. So take off to the north and then turn right. I already talked about that. If you may have heard, I'm the champion of an idea that some people don't appreciate. I think we could probably incorporate the use of medical team members or crew members for confirmation checks. I'm a champion of that. So, from the NTSB report, they come off the ground and the pilot flying, the captain says, got a positive rate, landing gear, bring the landing gear up, lights, the landing gear lights are off, turn the yaw damper on. So this is the citation center console. That button right there is how you turn on the autopilot, and that button right there is how you turn on the yaw damper. A yaw damper takes out the lateral oscillations that tends to make people get sick in an airplane. That's the purpose of a yaw damper. Oh, and down here, there is an annunciator for the aileron trim, and then down here, there is a thumb wheel that you can actually manipulate with your fingers, and the annunciators for the rudder trim. So those little controls live on the aft of the back end of the center console. So they get off, and the co-pilot calls controllers, hey, we're going to start our turn. And the first sign of trouble, the captain says, why am I fighting the controls here? And then he repeats, I'm fighting the controls. And the first officer grunts something that's unintelligible. Hey, are the wheels up? Did you bring the flaps up? So, ladies and gentlemen, if you work in an aircraft, what I would ask you to do is at the first sign of a malfunction or trouble, the first thing you do is you push the button on your transmit and you sound the alarm. If it's a new smell, even if it's a biological smell, if anything new is going on in your aircraft, you sound the alarm. What's going on? It's a new shake, shimmy, noise, vibration, anything different. First, sound the alarm. Something's going on, we have a problem, let's sort out what it is. The captain didn't really do that. The captain was basically in his own little world. He's not really paying attention to his co-pilot, and he's kind of talking to himself. Why am I fighting the controls here? He's thinking out loud. So for that aircraft, it says if you have a jammed elevator trim or for takeoff or go-around, this is the emergency procedure. Slow down, do not change flap position, do not retract landing gear, land as soon as practical. The training that I engage in is referred to as soft skills training. I don't know if you guys ever heard of soft skills. The FAA calls this soft skills. And I'm a big believer in it. But that soft skills and being a good team player does not replace the responsibility for me to be the master of my craft. When you prepare to intubate someone, you have to be the master of your craft, right? There's no excuse. And it's the same for your pilot. We have to be up on our game. So the reason the pilot doesn't take a checklist out, he doesn't think he needs it. I've been flying this aircraft for 20 years. I've got 10,000 hours. I don't need no stinking checklist. Captain makes his third mention. This, by the way, this happens very quickly. This event transpires very quickly. What the heck's going on? I'm fighting the controls. Now it's getting ready to get real. Because the co-pilot says, hey, how's your trim set? You got it the way you want it? Now finally the captain's going to begin to describe the problem. He's going to start to analyze this. I'm trying to turn right and the airplane's trying to turn left. First officer says, again, how's your trim down here? And at this point, the first officer is putting his fingers on either the rudder trim or the aileron trim, and he has not been commanded to do that. Trim's got nothing to do with this. That's what the captain was going to say. He's talking to the co-pilot like he's not really part of the team. And then ATC calls him. So they're not really communicating effectively. The way we solve a problem, whether it's two-pilot or single pilot, is we delegate duties and responsibilities. So if I'm a single pilot in a helicopter and a problem crops up, obviously, what's my number one job? Fly. Fly the helicopter. And that's the aviate, navigate, communicate, right? Aviate's first. And the only thing I have to do is fly, and I can ask you who are with me to do everything else. I don't need to do anything else. I don't need to talk on the radio. I don't need to try to get an autopilot to work. All I have to do is maintain control of the aircraft. And it's very important that we are able to do that for about the first minute. If you can get through the first minute, odds are you're going to be okay. They did not have good situational awareness. They weren't communicating. We do a situation assessment, we communicate, and that's how we have good SA, and we use good SA to make good decisions. So the investigators, they go talk to other citation pilots, and they said, you know, it's real easy in that airplane because those buttons are sitting right next to each other and they look exactly the same. It's extremely easy to reach down and hit the autopilot on instead of the yaw damper. And if you turn the autopilot on, it comes on in a dumb mode, which is called attitude hold, and it'll just, if you mash the if you press the autopilot button, we say mash in Savannah, Georgia. If you press the autopilot button, it'll come on in a dumb mode and the airplane will just try to hold what it's got. So it's trying to keep going the direction that they took off, and if I try to turn it, it's going to try to turn back. So the FAA said, you know, we've had these inadvertent autopilot activations, and you can do that. Occasionally, your autopilot will do something you didn't intend it to do, and the airplane or the helicopter will go a direction that you did not intend it to go. And if you're a pilot, it is extremely important to understand how to wrest control away from that autopilot or overpower it. The pilot is, no matter how many autopilots we put in our light single-engine helicopters, the pilot is ultimately the guy, he's the last line, or she is the last line of defense, and must be able to fly the aircraft. They never got out an emergency procedure checklist. The co-pilot was undoubtedly cranking rudder trim in to try to get the airplane to stop turning hard left. They did not coordinate with each other, and the first officer's been thrown under the bus for making things worse. And again, we communicate effectively when we're in an operational environment, and it's with accurate, bold, and concise communication. I would like you to do this. Captain says, something's wrong with the trim, the rudder trim. Yes, Captain, the problem is your co-pilot just cranked it over. That's the problem with the rudder trim. She's rolling. She's rolling. Hey, we've got a control problem. We need to go back to the airport. Finally, they're going to say, hey, we've got a problem. At the first sign of trouble, and there's any doubt about the safety of the flight, any doubt about what's happening, get on the radio and say we have a problem. Step number one, right? Sound the alarm. We got a problem. And don't be afraid to use the words Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. If you say Mayday 3 times on the radio, everybody else will shut up. You have the radio. You have all the assistance of ATC, fire rescue. Everybody's listening to you. People don't want to say that. They don't want to do that because I don't want to make a big fuss. It's not a real problem. I'm okay. We shouldn't treat things like that, because when you study crashes, you see that even on a beautiful day in a sophisticated helicopter, things can go from okay to bad very, very quickly. Right? And as Matt Zaccaro, who's the president of Helicopter Association International, says, if the flight is not going well, land the helicopter. Land. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what's wrong. I'm going to try to pull the circuit breakers, and the aircraft's going to roll upside down, and before an aircraft crashes, the last 2 words that comes out of a pilot's mouth is usually, oh crap, or something like that. So the NTSB basically hung these guys out to dry and said, they were just wrong from beginning to end. And where the error started was when the captain revealed his attitude. When he said, don't ask about the weather where we're going, because if the weather's below minimums, we're screwed. That was the first sign of trouble right there. That indicated that captain didn't have the right stuff. We don't want to do that. Okay, so you read about crashes, you read about bad things happening to people. It's very easy to say, I would never do that. I'm smarter than that. I'm better than that. I'm luckier than that. I don't want to think that when I walk out to a helicopter that tonight's the night. Nobody does. And so we have to have a way to overcome fear. And we use rationalization. I'm flying in a good, safe helicopter. I'm with a good team. I have a long history. So I anticipate that we will be cautiously optimistic and successful tonight. You don't ever, though, want to decide that bad things cannot happen to you, because nobody is immune. No company is immune. No EMS helicopter company is immune to an accident, and many companies have had an accident. No business model, whether you're for profit, whether you're not for profit. One engine, two engines, VFR, IFR, it does not matter. No one is immune. And a thing I do is I think back to the times when I was lucky. Not good, just lucky. And I've had some close calls in my time. So there's Pat, Diana, and Claxton. So Pat and crew flew from the Myrtle Beach area down towards Charleston. And as they were going down there, Tim Lilly, who was a pilot in the Charleston helicopter, he had gone up to Greenville that night. And they had a conversation on the radio about the weather. And Tim Lilly said to Pat, "The weather really sucks tonight. I mean, I looked at the radar. I think when you get to Charleston and you put that patient off at MUSC, I think you should go to our base and stay there. Because we're not going back to Charleston tonight. We're staying up in Greenville." The atmosphere was just exploding all around them. And Pat said, "Hey, man, thanks. Appreciate that. Appreciate that." But that's not what Pat did. That is not what Pat did. He went and got gas at Charleston International, and then he loaded his crew, and they started heading back towards Myrtle Beach. And they flew right into an area of convective activity in an A-Star helicopter. And Pat flew heavy twin-engine helicopters in the Marine Corps. And he was a very good pilot, and he was very confident in his ability to fly in the clouds, fly in adverse conditions. He'd flown in combat. That's all good stuff. But this is different. And an A-Star is different. An A-Star is a light aircraft, right? A BK, a 145, a 135, light aircraft. You have no business anywhere near any convective activity in a light aircraft. Do not go into a thunderstorm. Please. He flew right into weather. He went right by the Mount Pleasant Airport 15 minutes before he was dead. And guys, as they were flying along, they got so low. I don't know if you've ever heard of IFR, I follow roads. That's what helicopter pilots do when the weather gets really bad. Right? They got so low that witnesses in a vehicle on a 4-lane highway called US Highway 17, witnesses looked up and saw through the driving rain, saw a landing light shining down. That was this helicopter. And they had about 30 seconds left to live. Now, if a land. Okay. Complacency. Who here comes from a successful flight program? I do, right? Long-time successful flight program. I've presented at Boston Med Flight, Airlift Northwest, Med Center Air, a lot of Cadillac, I call them Cadillac flight programs. The best equipment, the best people, and you know, it's great, and these programs spend the money to do everything right. And that is wonderful. The only downside to that is when you're good and you know you're good, you relax. That's what happens. People that are really, really good at their job know they're good at their job. And complacency, as my friend Josh Henke, CalStar flight nurse now up at Life Flight of Maine, Josh says, it's like a little bitch that sneaks in, you know. It's just like it just weasels its way into your head, complacency does. It's just a troublemaker. Have you ever gone out to your aircraft in the morning, any of you clinicians, and you are going through your aircraft and you open up one of the bags that carries your equipment and you look in there and there's something that's supposed to be there that's not? Has that ever happened to anybody? That's complacency creeping into your organization. That's what that is. I want to introduce you to a young man that I never met, and I certainly wish I had. This is probably one of the finest young Americans that this country has ever produced. Lieutenant Commander Kevin Davis, United States Navy Blue Angels. He performed at an air show in Beaufort, South Carolina, at Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station, and I was there on a static display with a paramedic named Les Langdale. Before I get ahead of myself. Primary versus secondary tasks. Who in here has done an intubation? More than a couple. Okay, so think back to the first time you actually did an intubation on a living patient on the side of a highway, right? You might have been all into that evolution. It might have been taking every bit of your concentration, your brain power, and then as you do that over and over and over again, and you become more comfortable doing intubations and challenging intubations, and you get to where you can actually do an intubation and teach me how to do it. You can do it and talk while you're doing it, right? You can explain what you're doing. In the beginning, maybe not so much, because in the beginning, it took all of your acuity. When a pilot is learning how to fly, when a helicopter pilot's learning how to hover a helicopter, it takes every single bit of brain power to keep that helicopter in one spot to the point that you feel like your brain's about to explode inside your helmet. It's a primary task. And then over time, as we become more experienced, we get to the point where we can fly without conscious thought. As a matter of fact, you can get so good that I can fly and talk on 2 radios at once and talk about what we're going to have for lunch. We call that multitasking. My friend Bill Wynn with NEMSPA says that we actually don't multitask, we sequentially task, we just do it very quickly. We can fly and talk and think and teach. And it's good that we can fly without conscious thought. Anybody ever driven across town in an automobile and you get to where you're going and you realize you don't remember anything about the trip? That's called discrimination without awareness. And pilots do that all the time. So it's good that I can fly without thinking about it, because maybe you're asking me to help do something with a patient's lower extremity in an A-star helicopter. But if I'm distracted or upset or complacent or euphoric, maybe I will not perform a task to standard. And that's the trouble spot in this discussion. Fly the aircraft first. So let's take a short ride. This is a reporter named Steve who's flying with Kevin Davis.
If you're ready for
I can do this.
Wow. I went nowhere there for a while. Yeah, I took a little bit of a nap. That's all right. That happens on the Immelman quite frequently. Wow. All right, 450 knots. Looking for any obstructions. Aircraft looking good. Here we go. Take a deep breath. Flex your legs. Here's the burners. And here we go.
If you listen, you'll hear Lieutenant Commander Davis chuffing. You hear him? He's chuffing. It's called grunt breathing. That passenger's unconscious. There, he's coming back now.
You're back with me. Can you hear me, Steve? Yes. All right, you're back with me. Wow.
So these are G-forces by accelerations of the aircraft, and then we actually make the blood leave our brain. That's G-induced loss of consciousness.
Wow. That was a long one. If you're ready.
All right, we're good on that. So, back. So Kevin was as a Blue Angel guy, he was, let me back up. Top of his class in everything he did. An excellent young fellow, top of his class in high school, college, goes in the Navy, volunteers to be a jet pilot, top of his class in the jet community, goes out, flies in the fleet, volunteers to be a naval warfare instructor, does that. I mean, everything this guy does is perfect. Perfect. volunteers to be a Blue Angel pilot, competes against hundreds of other aviators, naval aviators, to get on that team. He is selected, and the year before you actually start performing, you're the PR guy. You fly the reporters, you fly Dale Earnhardt Jr. and people like that, and you're the announcer at the show. So if you've ever seen the Blue Angels perform, the guy talking on the microphone will be flying next year. So the day he died, it was his first performance. And his mom and dad were there, watching him. So he does this flawless performance as a Blue Angel pilot, first time ever. 150,000 people down on the ground watching him. He does it perfectly. And the show's over. The show ends. And the flight is to the northwest of the air station, and he's over here because the last maneuver they did separated him, and he's flying across the airfield. Stop for a minute. They don't wear G-suits. G-suits work and function like mass trousers. Blue Angels don't wear G-suits because they don't want a G-suit to inflate and move their hand when they're in close proximity to each other. Their technique is to grunt breathe, and they do a lot of weightlifting, they do a lot of squats, and they develop very strong leg muscles. And you may have heard him say, take a deep breath and flex those legs. So they can actually do that. They can flex their leg muscles, and this is designed to keep the blood from leaving their brain, right? So he's flying across this airfield, and everything's done. And remember, this is a capable pilot. And he says to the boss, "Boss, I'm out of position. I'll be right with you. I'm out of position. I'll be right with you. I'm here going this way. You're there going that way, and I'm here, and I want to be there." All right?
Your local recruiting office has the information needed to be a part of military units that embody these ideals.
He just crashed. No. Yep.
They didn't have something bad happen, did they?
He crashed.
No.
Yep.
So if you look at the top left video there, you'll see Kevin come in from the right, and he's going to put the aircraft into a right turn and pull 7 Gs. And I regret, but there's going to be a couple of annoying ads that are going to show under this video. There he is coming in from the top right. So he was going like this, and without conscious thought, and without taking a deep breath, and without flexing his legs, you're going that way, I'm going this way, I want to be in formation with you, move the stick. Action without conscious thought. What do you think may have led him to make that mistake? Want to hazard a guess, sir? Okay, that's an excellent answer and one I've never thought of. He wanted to look good, all right? So that's maybe a little self-induced pressure. Anybody else want to hazard a guess? Show's over, right? It's like the empty leg back to our base after we've dropped the patient off and we can all relax, right? Do you think that maybe he was elated? I'm a Blue Angel pilot. I just performed in front of God and everybody, and I did it perfectly. So maybe a little euphoric. A really tragic loss. And when I'm doing this presentation in a class, and there are pilots in there, and by the way, normally when I go out to a place and there's pilots, the pilots sit on the back row, and they sit like this. You know? So I talk about Kevin because I'm not a really smart fellow. I'm not particularly anything. But if that guy with all his training and all his background can have a momentary lapse, what pilot in this room could say, I would never do that? Who could say, I would never do that? This stuff applies to clinicians, by the way. Every bit of this. That some of the things you do are subject to the same hazardous attitudes. got to stay in the game. If it's your first day on the job or it's your last day on the job, you looking back over a 30-year career, you have to stay in the game. A macho individual is one who is very confident of his or her ability. They know that they are the best at what they do, and they are supremely confident in their ability. Can a woman suffer from machoism? Have you ever heard of Ronda Rousey? He or she thinks that they can do anything. They are overconfident. And invariably, and by the way, if there is a machoistic individual in your organization, most of the time people know who that person is. People know who these souls are. And one day you read about them in a newspaper. Almost 10 years ago now, going into the night, Trooper 2, operated by the Maryland State Police, crashed near Andrews Air Force Base. Pilot, paramedic, they picked up a clinician, a caregiver from the ground patient. The pilot was 1 year younger than me. He had the same rating that I have. He had about the same number of hours that I had. He, as I do, had to wear corrective lenses. He was a loved and respected member of his organization. He was a good guy. He was a good guy. He had 5,200 hours of flight time. He had demonstrated his ability to fly on instruments. When the flight assignment came in, the weather was a little sketchy in his area, and they were discussing it, and somebody noted that, well, you know, the other service just came in and landed. And unfortunately, he was recorded as saying, well, if they can do it, we can do it, which perhaps indicates a little bit of machoism creeping in, and maybe a little complacency, and perhaps fatigue was a factor in this. The FAA has identified fatigue as a contributing factor. Fatigue affects our ability to, it affects our mood, our performance, and our judgment. And when I read about this guy, and I thought, gosh, just like me, he did that. Could I do that? The NTSB said that he was in the clouds and he decided he didn't want to be in the clouds anymore. So he pushed the collective down. He wanted to get back into visual conditions. And he got down too low, didn't stop his descent. And they always have factors. He didn't have a lot of recent instrument experience. The organization got slammed for not having a good risk management process and a pilot's inadequate assessment of the weather. Squared away guy, heartbreaking. Oh, and a note. If your program has a helicopter and you have a letter of agreement with air traffic control for a transponder code, everybody know what a transponder is? If you have a letter of agreement with for a transponder code such as 0277, whatever it might be, I need you to understand that if you get into the clouds inadvertently and you're going to declare an emergency, you will not benefit from the feature of the FAA's radar called MSAW, or Minimum Safe Altitude Warning. Folks, if you're ever in a helicopter with me, a pilot, and I start talking about racing a thunderstorm, just not going. You know, most conservative response rule, we're not going. We're not going to race a thunderstorm. Frequently, the radar image you're looking at is 15 minutes old, so if the storm's developing and moving rapidly, you know, you may have somebody say, well, there's this little window of opportunity right here. Don't go through it. So the accident pilot, he says, I'm gonna come back. I want you to do me a favor. Call those nurses that are down in this hospital and tell them that I have left them. I'm coming back by myself. The other guy says, whoa, we'll send the van for all three of you. We'll send the truck. Nope, I'm coming back. And just as he was getting ready to pull pitch in that helicopter, the metal doors on the top room on the helipad slam open, and here's these two ladies. And they've got the stretcher, and they're like, hey, hey, here we are. We made it. Don't leave without us. And so they climbed in. There was so when the oncoming pilot called one cell phone, it rang on the lady's bed. She had neglected to take it with her, so it was in the quarters. So he called the other lady's cell phone after he sorted out the number, and she answered. She says, we're in the helicopter. Everything's good. How's the weather? And he looks out and he sees an antenna in the distance, and he goes, I can see the tower, so I think you've got the weather beat. I submit to you that that pilot will regret making that statement for the rest of his life, because they did not have the weather beat. They did not have the weather beat. This is aviation, ladies and gentlemen. Helicopters break. Patients are not as advertised. Things go south. The weather changes, and we get stuck. It's the nature of the job. Do not promise people that you will go home or you will do anything at a certain time. This is aviation. And this applies also, by the way, depending on what part of the United States you work in, if you're in a ground vehicle. It is possible in North Dakota or South Dakota or other places that, anyway, that you could go somewhere and get stuck by weather. And it's better to be stuck than scared. You do not have to be anywhere. We're on a roll. Let's talk about impulsivity. This was a personal, real bugaboo for me for a long time. I still kind of suffer from it. Impulsivity. Immediate action without thought. Several years ago, a Rescue Air 1 pilot, which was a program in Atlanta, bought by Omniflight bought by Air Methods. A Rescue Air 1 pilot left Atlanta with his crew and went to Greenville, South Carolina to drop the patient off. And they did that. And they're done with that now, and they go to the nearby airport for the three things that we want in the middle of every flight: jet fuel, lemonade, and cookies. So they go over to Greenville. It's a beautiful day. By the way, this didn't kill anybody. So just say that right there. Nobody died in the making of this story. Donnie Thompson was the flight nurse on this aircraft, and he's alive and well. So they go and they get their supply items, and then the three of them troop out to the helicopter, probably like 3 ducks in a row. This is what we do, right? We go out to our aircraft, and we all do a walk around. Everybody do a walk around? When you're walking around looking at your helicopter, are you confirming that everything's right, or are you looking for something that's wrong? Look for something that's wrong. I left the latch open, and it's up to you to catch it, and if you catch it, the guy who left it open owes everybody pizza for dinner that night. Make that a policy at your base. Pilot, you leave a latch open, we catch it, you buy pizza. A friend of mine started that in South Carolina. He's bought pizza twice in 10 years because a crew has caught the latch. So they go out and they all walk around. They check the latches, and everything seems to be good. Donnie Thompson. So they take off and they're flying along, and they haven't gone very far before there's an exclamation from the back of the aircraft. Oh, shoot! The key's not on the hook. And the key in question is the key to the fuel cap. And for some reason, I usually keep the A-Star key in the baggage box, but for some reason they kept it in the cabin, and it's normally where you can see it, and it's not there. And that paramedic makes that exclamation, and the pilot sitting up front doesn't say a word. If you fly with a human being like me, and my behavior ever changes markedly, right? I'm quiet and now I get talkative, or I'm talkative and now I get quiet, you need to start asking questions and you need to investigate. Because you're the last line of defense between me and a mistake. So the pilot sitting up front doesn't say a word. He's just sitting there just motoring along. You know what he's thinking? Any idea what he's thinking? The fuel cap's off. Oh, shoot. I'll bet you I'm going to get back to Atlanta and there's going to be no fuel cap on this helicopter. God, I wonder if I left it on the step and it fell off. Oh, shoot, I'm going to get in trouble. I may get fired. And he's not doing anything. He's just sitting there having these thoughts. And then out of the blue, he says, guys, there's a big old field in front of me. I'm going to land here and we're going to see about this fuel cap. He's a good guy. This guy flew for years, just like me. Great guy. He can fly without thinking about it. So he drives the helicopter straight in there. This is what he does not do. And if you've been flying for a day, you know that there is a normal sequence of events when we are preparing to land somewhere. We fly in at a high safe altitude, and we do a thing called a high recon. And we verbalize a before landing check, and we announce, I think the winds are from over here, right? And by the way, if the winds aren't from over there, they're over there, and you realize that, like the smoke's going the wrong way, or the flag's going the wrong way, speak up. If I'm making a mistake, you speak up. He doesn't do any of that. And you know, we turn final, and we say, okay, we're on final approach now. We're doing a low recon. We're going to confirm our high recon. Everything's looking good. I don't see any wires. Constant communication back and forth. It's operational communication at this point, not what's for lunch. And we're going to go in there, and at some point, you're going to feel the helicopter start to shake a little bit. Anybody ever felt the helicopter shake? That's the effective translational lift shudder. And we approach at the apparent rate of closure of a brisk walk. If you're an Air Methods pilot, you make the last 300 feet of your descent at 200 feet per minute or less, which is excruciatingly painful. That's how Air Methods rolls. It's all good. And they do that so they won't get into vortex ring state, and they do that so they won't hit a wire. It's a good, safe practice. It's just painful. This pilot doesn't do that. He drives this perfectly good helicopter right into this field and does that on a beautiful day. How on earth did that happen? Now I say, Donnie, why didn't you say go around? Who in this room can call a go around in a helicopter? Anytime you perceive that I, your pilot, am off my game, there's something wrong and you don't know what it is, don't start it. I mean, that's not time to ask questions. First thing is, we're going to pull up on the collective. Let's do a go around and let's sort out what's happening here. Are you okay? Are you upset? Dan, are you upset about something? Because this is not how you normally behave. It is okay for you to ask questions of your pilot. How many pilots you got in the front of your helicopter? One. You got two? Yeah, you're exceptionally, that's a rare occurrence. Where do you work? Outstanding. I'm sorry? Okay, super, super. Well, for the rest of us that have one pilot, it's extremely important that everybody who can help with that scenario understands how things work. You have to understand how humans work. So what we have to do, gang, every single day, from day one to day last, when we go to our job, we look at each other as resources. You're a resource to me, and I'm a resource to you. And you, just as we evaluate the condition of the aircraft, we evaluate each other. Are you okay? If I'm upset about something when I go to work, if you're upset about something when you go to work, when you do your beginning of shift briefing, confess that right then. I've had a bad day today. A rock flew up and hit my windshield. I've had a bad day today. I got served with divorce papers. I've had a bad today, whatever. Confess. If something's bothering you, confess. And then, maybe you say, hey, I want you to watch me tonight. Keep an eye on me because I may not be on my game 100%. It's a team effort. As an AMRM instructor, I firmly believe that the key to success is that the people that get into that helicopter support each other, back each other up, communicate with each other, keep each other apprised of the situation. I hope I said that word right. In a two-pilot aircraft, those two pilots, they're up there monitoring each other, right? That's pilot flying, pilot monitoring. That's the terminology in the FAA now. Pilot flying, pilot monitoring. In a single pilot helicopter or a single pilot airplane, the last line of defense is you. You are. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dan Foulds. It's been my distinct pleasure to spend this time with you today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference and safe travels home. Thank you very much.